great to be here, and it's particularly great to be here with friends like Bob and like Joe. I was a student of Joe's, so anything I say here that's wrong is clearly his fault and not mine. So let me just have a few thoughts based on these two. The first is, we would all like to live in a world in which regional institutions had the kind of constraints on the Chinese and everybody else. Like that hasn't happened in Asia. And when I lived in Japan as the Times bureau chief 20 years ago, there were discussions about building an OSCE kind of structure in Asia. And everybody immediately came to the conclusion that wasn't likely to work, just given the nature of the kind of countries and the absences of alliances. And it's even harder to imagine today, because we know that while China has joined many of these institutions, the institutions have changed because of China almost as much as we had expected that the institutions would themselves constrain China. WTO is a really interesting example, where when they joined, and I remember covering the debate about this in the lame duck Senate in 1998, the Clinton administration's argument at that time was bringing China into the WTO would fundamentally change its behavior. And I'm not sure, except around the margins, that has yet happened. In part, that hasn't happened because when Xi Jinping talks about a new type of great power relations, what he's really talking about is changing the norms and institutions, or at least having as much influence on them as the United States and Britain had when many of these institutions were set up in World War II or prior to that. And, you know, the Chinese students study the Spanish-American War more carefully than almost any other period in American history, and it's not for nothing. You know, Joe and our colleague Graham Allison and I all like to fish up in sections of Alaska that were neatly taken by the United States, particularly along the Canadian border, in an act that the Chinese could only admire today and are clearly trying to replicate. So how do you create this sort of culture of dialogue that the document setting up today's event described, when you have at least one power that is out there to go change the nature of the norms? Well, we have a few interesting test cases. The islands, of course, are one of them, and that's all been covered. Bob made brief reference to cyber, and that's another fascinating one because it's an area where there aren't many norms right now. And President Obama's early efforts to force the Chinese into sort of discussing them, most recently when they met at the summit meeting 17 months ago in California, basically, at least on the first pass, didn't result in much. And that's why the United States went ahead and indicted 3 members of Unit 61398 back in June, not because they ever thought that these guys would ever show up on the inside of an American court, which I don't think they ever will, unless they decide to take their kids to Disneyland or something like that, but instead because they thought this would sort of jolt the Chinese into a real conversation. At least so far as I can tell, it hasn't had that effect. It may, but the initial reaction was to sort of cut off dialogue, and one of the interesting results that we should be looking for, I know we are looking for this week with the president in Beijing, is whether or not you begin to see that dialogue get restored. But it's an interesting first test because it is, as Harper pointed out, one of these high-end areas of conflict, and at the second, in the second order, it's an example of where we can set norms where right now there aren't many norms. So it doesn't get into that issue that the Chinese have of trying to alter norms that were set in a discussion they weren't involved in initially. It also means getting accustomed to the use of routinized Chinese presence elsewhere around the world where we haven't seen them. So we all applauded their showing up to combat piracy off Somalia. And That was sort of the first big out of area, but in their interests element. Now we've seen one of those submarines that you just heard about go through and do a tour of the Persian Gulf. So we believe it did from American military sources. And we're likely in the next 6 months to a year to see the first nuclear-armed submarine take a big, long loop. That will certainly revitalize a group that wanted to work toward containment of Chinese military power when George Bush came into power. And 9/11 sort of threw them off of their agenda, and they ended up focusing that energy on Iraq. That worked out fine. And now you're beginning to hear that group sort of come back a little bit as the Chinese are significantly more capable. But I think the hardest part of this is going to be balancing, on the one hand, a common definition of this new type of great power relations. And if you haven't seen it, Jane Perlez has a really interesting piece in today's Times on how President Obama and President Xi view that phrase differently, with our effort to make sure that the Chinese are, as Joe has told us many times, self-containing in some of their power. There are some acts that they would probably like to take at some point that they simply can't because they would blow up on them. That's why you don't hear very much these days about people warning that the Chinese would go liquidate their holdings in U.S. Treasuries, which obviously they can't do without devaluing many of their own holdings. And so I think the trick here is figuring out how to leverage that self-containment concept that Joe has taught all of us, and how to make the most of that. It's not going to work in the South China Sea. It may work in the East China Sea for the reasons that Joe laid out. And how to get the country, the United States, accustomed to the fact that we are going to see the Chinese in many parts of the world now where we've never seen them before.
Can we just